I appreciate that collectors are now coming back around to quartz watches and not just shunning them. And that for me is one of the best ones, you know?
I think we get wiser too. I mean, especially when you talk about 10 years ago, you and I both probably were into larger watches.
Yes.
You know, and that was the trend. And I look back on it now and I'm like, what was I thinking?
Like all of this here has to be fun. If it stops being fun and you start caring way too much about what other people think, then there's no point, you know?
Yeah, I'm just a guy that's in the hobby, that loves watches. I've been collecting for about 15 years. I feel like a lot of times watch insiders specifically, they gotta be real careful about what they say. I don't have to be careful about what I say, right?
Absolutely adore this dial. It is the only Rolex stone dial with diamonds that I personally like.
If I were buying today, that it would be probably this watch.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Menta Watches YouTube channel. Today we are joined by my friends from upstate Florida. They are the Watch Bros. You could find them on YouTube. We have Felix and Jason. We just sat down and filmed an interview for their channel, so we will link it in the description. Go check that out below. Jason actually picked up a fantastic Royal Oak from us a month ago or so.
Yeah, it's probably been about 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, so we wanted to sit down, talk to him about the watch, talk to him about his channel, and then of course he wanted to see some other watches to kind of get a little guidance as to what might be the next purchase.
Absolutely.
So before we jump into the watches, tell us about the channel. I was watching one of your videos where it's like, if I got to start all over again, the collecting mistakes, so you guys do a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah, you know, the channel really is just about collectors and the lens from a collector, right? So we're not watch insiders. I'm not a watch dealer. So I'm just a guy that's in the hobby, that loves watches. I've been collecting for about 15 years. And we wanted to create a channel just from that lens alone. Like, what is it like? A platform where we could have our own opinions.
Sure.
Because I feel like a lot of times watch insiders specifically, they got to be real careful about what they say. I don't have to be careful about what I say, right? So,
but yeah, I really like what you guys are doing. The videos are very well thought out, well produced. Good job, Felix. It's interesting content for the actual collector that doesn't want some bias. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it was
so we never talked about it. Why did you go for, and I love this reference, the 25730. It's actually one I've never owned for myself, but we've sold plenty of them. I've always admired it. I love the functionality. Why did you decide to go for that watch?
For so many reasons.
Okay.
One is the Royal Oak, and on my channel I talk about this. That was the first luxury watch that caught my eye outside of Rolex.
Okay.
I think most people have a very similar journey in collecting, right? You know about Rolex, you don't have the money to buy a Rolex, so then you find these other brands.
Yep.
You explore Timex and Seiko and Longines and maybe eventually a Tudor, and you kind of progress, and then eventually you get a Rolex, right? So you get a Rolex, and then that's the ultimate in your mind because you don't know any different. And then you find out, wait a second, there's this holy trinity that I've never heard about. There's all of these independent watchmakers that I don't know about. There's German watches like a Lange & Söhne, like, and then everything opens up. For me, it was the Royal Oak. That was the first watch that I understood was luxury outside of Rolex. So it holds a really special place in my heart because it allowed me to experience all these other watches. I do have a modern 15510.
Okay.
I bought that some years ago. So I've been on the search for like another AP, potentially Royal Oak.
Right.
I've seen this watch sell a couple of times, and it's a watch that I was always attracted to. Specifically though, so this dial is nice and creamed. I mean, the eye appeal, which we talked about in the other, is absolutely phenomenal on this piece. I've seen some other pieces where it's just a crisp white dial. Maybe it's a service dial, maybe it just didn't patina, I don't know. I really wanted one that had this cream. I've missed out on a handful over the last year or so. And when I saw this pop up on your website, I knew that I had to have it.
And yeah, and it was like a crisp, unpolished, full set, like everything.
Bro, when I read it, and it was like, you were like, this has never been touched, unpolished. And when you and I were talking, you were like, I can send it for polishing or you can take it the way it was. I was like, no, I'm taking it the way that it is because I want to leave it exactly how it's been worn, and it's in great condition.
And there's nothing wrong with a polished watch, you know? Like, is it beneficial in a vintage watch to have it unpolished? Sure, because it's going to be worth a little more, but that just means you pay a little less for the polished version. So we have one for sale with Walker's Vintage right now, the store that we provide watches to here in Miami.
Yeah.
And same reference, but it has a gray dial, but it's the same thing. It has like a nice like patina tropicalization to it. And I've never seen one age quite like that. The case has been lightly polished, but it's a fantastic watch. And I just love on this one too, the way the gold bezel is aged as well. I don't know if you ever noticed it. It's like tarnished, just like it's like a darker yellow.
It's got a patina.
Right, yeah.
Which is beautiful.
Fantastic example, and you just don't get that charm from a lot of the modern Royal Oaks these days. You really don't, you know? So, and not that that's like the craziest vintage watch, it's 90s, you know? It's not, you know, a 70s 5402, but like it gives you that like kind of vintage feel, and like you said, like eye appeal, you know? It has something a little bit different to it, a little bit more character and aging, you know?
Yeah.
No, fantastic watch, dude.
It is.
My first Royal Oak, actually, now that you're making me think about it, was a two-tone owl. And the only reason I remember selling it, is because that watch, the way you adjust the calendar functions is all through the crown, and it's not quick set. You know, you have to go back and forth, back and forth. So I remember I had it on a winder, and it was set on the same calendar. And this is when I was just a collector, not a dealer. And I left it off a winder, and I went on like a family vacation. And I came back 7 days later, or a week, 10 days later, and it was completely off calendar. And I'm like, I don't have the patience to sit and set this. And something else had come along, as it always does. And so I was like, okay, time to sell this one and move on. But I was just like, I can't deal with it. I need some buttons or something to set it quickly.
I love the story that you ended up selling that because you didn't have the patience to set 10 more days.
It wasn't the only
I know it's not the only reason, but
it was a nice motivating factor.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it was a nice motivating factor. So you pulled out a watch that I was shocked to see you pull out. You know, after I pulled out some stuff that I thought you might be interested in. Before we get into our watches, tell me how you came across this. Is a really rare watch. So tell me about this.
So this is the Vacheron Royal Chronometer. It's the 2215. This actually predates the 222. And from my research, and actually I brought it because I wanted to learn a little bit more about it, but from my research, the Royal Oak came out in 72. This came out in 74, and that is 1 year prior to the Nautilus. Nautilus came out in
Correct,
75.
76, yeah.
Yeah. So the research that I've done, it seems to me that this is the second steel integrated sports watch that was made.
By Vacheron, you mean?
No,
or just general?
First by Vacheron,
right.
before the 222.
This predates the 222.
But the second after the Royal Oak, I'm assuming, unless there's something else.
I've never thought about it, but you're probably right, you know? And this is like a very uncommon watch, and especially with diamond markers, like you just never, we've sold, dude, I would say 3-4 pieces in 10 years of this model. But I've never thought about whether it was a second integrated bracelet sports watch. But you know what? After we're done rolling, I'm going to look that up because I think you're right. I think you're right.
I think I might be right.
So how did you come across this? Like what was, you know, what made you jump for this one, you know?
Two things. Just as you know, you go down rabbit holes when you're collecting.
Right.
So I'm looking for a 222. This was a few years ago. And I ran across a photo of this while I was searching for a 222. And I'm like, what is this? And then, you know, I find the reference number 2215. There's no information online about this watch just because I didn't realize it at the time, but because it's so rare and because it's so unknown, there's just not a
lot of scholarship. Yeah, that happens a lot with a lot of watches.
Yeah, and so it always stuck with me. I was like, that is a badass watch. Of course, there were none for sale. I'm scouring, I can't find anything. And then funny enough, about a year and a half or so ago, Hodinkee released a video with a collector up in New York, and he had bought a gold version of this watch.
Okay.
And I was like, that's that watch that
it's eluding you.
That I've been searching for like 3 years. I was, you know, this is incredible. And I really love the story behind it. Apparently the piece that he was looking at, potentially Brad Pitt was also looking at it at the same time. It's a really cool video.
Right.
Hodinkee put together.
Yeah, Brad Pitt's a big VC guy.
Yeah, he's big VC. But he ended up getting it. That kind of sparked me on the hunt for it. So what I would do is I literally would set a reminder, and about once every 2 or 3 weeks, I would just go search to see if I could find one. And I came across a dealer in Singapore that had that watch, and started messaging with him, and ended up picking it up. And then since I've got it, I mean, I got it.
It's so nice.
I got it because I knew it was rare.
Right.
And I wanted something special in my collection. I feel like in my collection I do have some other special pieces, but I wanted something that was really special. And what was astounding to me was I feel that that's a very special watch, and the price was attainable for me.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of, I mean, it's an expensive watch, but very attainable compared to how rare it is.
Right, and this is obviously cheaper than a 222 counterpart, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, people always often overlook the fact that like you could get something very rare, very special, very unique without having to spend Nautilus Royal Oak crazy money. There is such a wide world of stuff out there. I had somebody on Instagram, who's a collector, and he's trying to trade into something a little bit more substantial, and he goes, "Oh, I realize this is, way below your pay grade." I'm like, dude, there's no watch that's below my pay grade. Like a cool watch is a cool watch. We will sell anything that's a couple $100 up to a couple, it doesn't matter. What if it's cool and we like it, that's all that's important. It really doesn't matter. Like if you go through our safe, it runs the gauntlet in terms of pricing.
Yeah.
We just try to find the cool and interesting stuff, which you certainly hit the bullseye. This is it, So it's funny because I pulled out something very similar, but not from VC, from AP. This is actually, again, one of my favorite watches that a lot of people overlook. This is a reference 6005, nicknamed the Square Royal Oak. They only produce this watch in quartz. There's a few different sizes. There's like a ladies, slightly bigger, and then this, I guess, is their jumbo size. Or maybe there's only 2 sizes, 2 or 3. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they made this steel 2-tone solid gold. This one in stainless steel and gold, so 2-tone, kind of like your Royal Oak. Also, same condition style, amazing dial, amazing case, amazing bracelet, unpolished. For me, we had one of these recently in steel, and it was like the only one I've ever had that was like perfect unpolished full set, and I put it on. I'm like, man, I can't sell this. And then of course the client was like, I really want that. I'm like, all right, fine. But when you put these on your wrist, you got to try it on. Like they just wear so incredibly well on the wrist, and I have a feeling it's going to be, you're going to tell me it's similar to your VC, but the way it sits on your wrist, the thinness of it, and the wrist presence, like it's just something that like I don't understand why these watches are overlooked as much as they are. It just sits on your wrist perfectly, and it's such an easy watch to wear. And I like the fact that also quartz is now not so shunned by collectors. I think the Elegante really changed a lot of people's mindsets that you can have interesting quartz watches, and there's a time and place for everything. And I like to look at watches like from a historical context. So when you think about these watches and the quartz crisis and everything that was going on, it's an important part of history. It's an important part to think of like the human mindset and like how people were panicking and how the world was changing, and kind of similar to what we're going through now with technology and AI and all that stuff. I appreciate that collectors are now coming back around to quartz watches and not just shunning them. And that for me is one of the best ones, Yeah,
that is a beautiful watch. It does wear very similar. Obviously that's a nice slim case because of the quartz that's in there. It allows it to get so slim. But yeah, it's a very similar wear. It's proportioned very well. It's got a beautiful dial.
I love that it's the same bracelet as the Royal Oak, which is for me one of the best bracelets they ever made. So a lot of the other stuff I picked out to kind of give you a taste of, because we haven't talked too in depth about what you're looking for, was obviously a nice smattering of vintage Rolex, because I think you mentioned that you have a birth year GMT, but I'm not sure what beyond that. I did pull out one other Vacheron before I even knew that you had the chronometer Rolex.
Yeah, this is interesting.
This is I also another era of watch that I think is largely overlooked, and I think it's changing because people's interest in this particular model has really upticked in the past few years. This is the first generation overseas. 42042 is the reference, the jumbo size, and so now we know the overseas is this like behemoth sports watch for Vacheron. But when this watch came out, it was really kind of like overlooked. No one really gave a shit about it. And I think to this day, still people don't care as much about the early generation overseas because it doesn't have quite the history as the Royal Oak, the 222, the Nautilus, But at the end of the day, this has become like the staple marquee sports watch for Vacheron, And so I see a lot more interest in these early overseas. The 42042 was like late 90s to early 2000s.
It looks
like 96 or so.
It looks very late 90s, like in design.
Yeah.
Which I like. 5 years ago, I would have been like, oh, that watch is gross. Obviously, trends change, your tastes change, you become, more experienced. But I love the look of this.
It's funny how you say that too, because like I find myself, gravitating towards watches that, a decade ago, same thing, I would have been like, dude, not for me, And also watches that I liked 10 years ago, I no longer am a fan of, So it's funny how, life kind of throws those curveballs at you, where it's, you find yourself evolving,
Well, I think we get wiser too. I mean, especially when you talk about 10 years ago, and we talked about it a little bit in there, but you and I both probably were into larger watches.
Yes.
You know, and that was the trend. And I look back on it now and I'm like, what was I thinking?
So there's a photo of me, I think it's somewhere on Facebook, where I was sitting behind my desk in Moscow with a 47mm Panerai like this on. You know, just somebody snapped a photo of me. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
And it's just like this massive brick on my wrist, and I used to love those watches, and I still have a lot of appreciation for earlier Panerai, the pre-Vendome, pre-A stuff. You know, I still think they're historically an important brand, and they made some really interesting watches. I think they kind of lost their path, you know, around a decade, 15 years ago, and kind of started going astray in a lot of different weird directions with the brand, but that doesn't take away from a lot of the earlier stuff. And I know a lot of collectors that I met, you know, that are massive vintage collectors now that started with Panerai. We met through the Panerai forums, you know, but tastes change, you know? So the rest I brought out for you. I don't know what you've experienced, what you haven't. So we have on the top here we have our sports Rolex, all plastic crystal, all from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And on the bottom here, we have a little bit dressier, couple different interesting stone dial dates.
I'm drawn to a couple immediately when you brought these out. And just for reference, if anybody watches our channel, there's 3 of us total. One of them's not here with us. One of them is a huge Rolex fanboy.
Okay.
Talking modern Rolex, like
Sure.
huge fanboy. I'm the opposite.
Okay.
So I'm a huge critic for modern Rolex, but I absolutely love vintage Rolex.
Okay.
So the 2 that stand out is this Daytona.
Right.
And then this dial is like wild.
So let's start with this date. This is a 118208, so it's a little bit more of a modern reference, you know, double quick, smooth bezel date, but it was built with a factory rubellite diamond dial. Rubellite is the stone that has this beautiful purple magenta color, and it's funny because this is the second one we've ever had.
Yeah.
The first one we had a few years ago, I remember we posted on Instagram and it went viral. It was viral, had like over 50,000 likes and comments, and then it still didn't sell. Like, had all these people who went crazy for it, but then it didn't sell. It took a couple more months to sell, and then after it sold, the post continued to go, and people kept messaging like, "Hey, you still have this watch?" And I'm like, "Sorry, it sold already," you know, which is wild because everybody loved it, but then it still took a while to sell, and then they still wanted it, and I had not been able to find another one since. We had a local collector come in who bought this one at auction a few years ago, you know, had his fun, was ready to move on, full set box papers, and I was like, dude, you need to leave that with me, because I absolutely adore this dial. It is the only Rolex stone dial with diamonds that I personally like. Generally, I prefer stone dials from the 60s and 70s that are just clean, you know? So they have this dial, for example, or like a lapis dial with like the 6 and 9 diamond marker, and I just can't stand that watch. It needs to be just purely the stone. This one is a 18038, so a single quick first reference sapphire date with a factory onyx dial. Early version too, because it's like from 1979, also box papers. Onyx, while probably the least interesting stone, because, you know, with like rubellite and lapis and malachite and all these interesting stones, every one is like a work of art. They're all different by default. Onyx, they're all the same. That being said, I don't know, something about yellow gold and onyx, the combination for me just crushes. Like, it is just such a sleek, like all-encompassing, like you look down at it, it's like staring back at you. I don't know, I've always just gravitated towards that watch so much.
Are you a yellow gold or rose gold guy?
I am neither. I'm a white metal or steel guy. I generally don't wire a lot of yellow or rose gold. I dabble on the weekends, I'd like to say, you know?
Like a weekend watch?
Yeah, you know, and it's funny because for the longest time, it was more of like a self-conscious thing where I felt like I looked tacky and like full yellow gold. I wear yellow gold on like a leather strap, and I was sitting with a client, it had to have been a couple years ago at this point. He was like, dude, that's main character syndrome. Like, you think it looks bad and tacky, but no one else cares. No one else, you know, thinks it looks stupid. And I'm like, you're right. My mind frame, you know, kind of shifted. I started wearing more full yellow gold watches. And so now I'll wear them out, you know, generally like, oh, go out to dinner, you know, going out with the wife or something like that. I'll wear a full yellow gold watch. It's not a daily wear for me though. I don't know. I just always like the tone down, and I like also the weight of steel. I like lighter watches personally. And so obviously precious metals tend to be a little heavier.
Yeah, you know, that's funny. That's actually the reason that I think I gravitate toward yellow gold now, is because of the perception of tackiness. So like, it's
lean into it.
Yeah, it's almost
lean
like
into it.
Because, again, talking about trends, 10 years ago, I would have never worn a two-tone or a yellow gold.
Right.
I was like, dude, that is a granddad's watch. The yellow's so tacky. That's like power broker, 80s power broker. And now I'm like, I want to experience that.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, man, I want a yellow gold. I like it because of that.
Well,
because that
jewelry, watches, and stuff like that, and precious metals are very in fashion now. You have like a lot of the younger generation that want that like Art Deco, like cool, you know, whatever. So I think perceptions are just changing so quickly, you know, as it relates to watches and a lot of other things, you know. Like you said, trends come and go, and our perceptions change and our tastes change as a result. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we're allowed to evolve and grow and change our minds, you know. This has to be fun. Like all of this here has to be fun. If it stops being fun and you start caring way too much about what other people think, then there's no point, you know?
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Have fun with it. That's what I try to do. You and I talked about it. Buy what you like.
Listen, at the end of the day,
don't care about what other people think, right?
At the end of the day, these are non-essential luxury items. We don't need any of these. We just love them, you know?
Exactly.
For sometimes we can explain it in words, sometimes we can't explain it, you know? So at the end of the day, you know, if what you're doing and what you're purchasing is not making you happy, then you need to stop doing it.
Period.
Plain and simple.
I agree.
So
let's move to this last.
Okay.
So tell me what.
So we're going to move the GMT out of the way. I brought this out before I knew you had a birth year, which, by the way, kudos to you.
Yeah.
We generally don't like doing birth year. This would have, you said your birth year is what?
78.
78. So this would be 10 years prior to that. We don't need to go into this one.
What a beautiful case.
Yes.
I'm telling you right now, because I've seen so many of these.
Right.
I mean, that is a nice, solid, hefty. It's not been, I'm sure it's been
So
polished
you have
a
no
couple
idea.
times,
No, this one actually appears
think so?
unpolished. Yeah, it's just worn. It's just worn. You can see the original bevels. But this watch came to us fresh out of Mexico. We get a lot of 1675s in it, but we turn away. You can't even imagine how many more just because wild deal for polished case or damaged dial.
Yeah.
This one was just like the whole package. Beautiful dial, beautiful handset, beautiful Fat Fawn original bezel, with a nice fade to it, strong case, nice bracelet. It was just like the whole to-do. We haven't listed this one yet, but it's going up soon. So I brought out a few Submariners just to kind of get like nerdy, because we were talking about this before, about how, like, you know, sometimes these nerdy details come out. This is not a Rolex, if you notice, it's a Tudor. These are essentially the same watch. And I say essentially because they're both a reference 5513. They're only a few years apart from each other, but they're very, very different once you start looking at the details. So this one here on the right is from the late 60s. I think it's 67, 68. It has the first iteration of the 5513 matte dial, which is called a meters first dial. So you have the depth rating with meters before feet. You have the early version of the bezel that was used throughout the early to mid 60s, a long 5 insert they call it. And you have the
bezel.
Earlier style bracelet, 7206 Swiss rivet bracelet that they phased out right around 1970, 71. Going into a mid-70s watch, this one is, again, the same watch essentially, but with Rolex's little changes over the years. They produce several different dial variants, and this one is one that is really favored by collectors because it's called the Maxi dial. If you look at them side by side, which I'm sure I'm telling you something you already know, but if you look at them side by side, you'll see the lume plots are a little bit bigger in appearance, which is why a lot of people like them, because they kind of tend to pop. Upgraded style of bezel insert, you no longer have the long 5, and I think the biggest thing is that you have much heftier bracelet. This is when they already transitioned into the 93150 flip lock bracelet, so it's a lot sturdier, and that's one of the biggest critiques of early vintage subs and GMTs, that the bracelets could get really flimsy, especially with the rivets as they wore out. You don't really tend to see that as much on these like heavier oyster bracelets, you know, so it's a lot more sturdy of a watch, feeling a little bit more akin to a modern.
A little more premium.
Right, exactly. But all things being equal, you know, I'm always going for the watch that I like aesthetically the best and the best condition, you know? So I generally, you know, there used to be a massive premium attached to meters first or a certain maxi dial or this, that, or the other, all these little details. And that's not to say that they're not important, because, you know, if it matters to you, then it absolutely is important. For me, I like to buy the watch that A, is in the best condition, and B, the one that speaks to me the most, you know? So like, I'll keep something that other people be like, well, why do you like them? It's because I fucking like it, you know, and that's the simple answer to it, you know?
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't have to be, you know, some obscure change on a dial for you to like the piece. It could just be that, you know, you like that version for whatever reason, because like you said, the lume plots are bigger on this one, and maybe that's a more common dial, but to you it doesn't matter because that's just what you're into, what you're attracted to. Tell me about the Tudor. This is a really
I like the reference by itself. This is a reference 7016, so it's right after the 7928, so it's end of 60s, early 70s. It's Tudor's Submariner. It's essentially, you know, if you held them up side by side to somebody who doesn't know better, they'd think it's the same watch. Yeah. I just like to pull these out for people to understand that you don't always have to go for a Rolex to get the same kind of watch. You know, you could go for something a little cheaper. Not that this one in particular is any cheaper because it has military provenance. It was given as a gift to a commander, you know, fantastic condition, you know, like barely used, you know, over the years kind of thing. I mean, used, but for a vintage watch, it's very, very, very nice. This one was like 1969, if memory serves.
That bezel original?
Yes. Also, original bezel, fat font bezel, where they transitioned into it. Yeah. So the pip was changed, but I mean, what are you going to do? I remember we got this watch 8 years ago. It was like a barn find out of an auction, like a small auction house. And then it was sitting in my personal collection that I was telling you with one specific collector where we just kind of kept watches together. Yeah. We sold it to a musician in Canada and then just took it back in trade, you know, and I'm always happy to have these kind of watches in stock because A, the condition on it is amazing, but B, I just like what they represent, you know, in terms of offering somebody an option, you know, where it's like you don't always have to go Rolex, you know?
And you like what you like. So if you were to ask me as a collector, to me, that's a cooler watch.
Yeah.
And I love the history of the sub, and I love all of the different dial variations, and I love how it progressed. But to me, having that Tudor is just feels more special to me.
Yeah, and when you start looking at like the details, you know, you have the same Mercedes hands, for example, but the Tudor has a large lollipop hand, which really pops. The lume dots are similar to like a Maxi, but then you have this early rose logo with the smiley on the bottom. Like, it's just, there's so much going on. Like, and you know what, if like this configuration was in a Rolex or like a 4-line or whatever, it would be so much more money, you know? So just because it has R instead of T, you know? Yeah, granted, you know, different caliber, you know, 1520, 1530 versus an ETA movement, okay. But these are purpose tool watches, you know? At the end of the day, they were made for diving. So that ETA movement is going to be just as good. And when you're underwater, you know, looking at it.
Case made by Rolex?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. You know, a lot of this was made by Rolex, and then it's just got a different movement.
Exactly. You know, and this was just their more affordable budget version, you know, and at the end of the day, a lot of these Tudors are way rarer than the Rolex counterparts. Way rare, way harder to find in good condition. A lot of these Tudors were used as military watches, so you'll see Tudor Argentinian issued watches, you'll see military issued watches, you'll see a lot of these as gifts, you know, to various military counterparts. Like Tudor was a popular brand back in the day, where, as you know, you didn't want to break the bank with Rolex, and not that Rolex was particularly expensive back then, but it was a more of a luxury product, you know. So whereas the sub was probably, I don't know, $220, the Tudor was probably $80, you know. Yeah. So, and you're getting essentially the same watch, and I think that carries through to today, where you could pick up a really awesome vintage Tudor for half the price of its Rolex counterpart, and you're getting such a similar watch, you know?
Yeah. And you're getting a kind of a little more special store. My first vintage purchase actually was a vintage Tudor two-tone Oyster Prince.
Nice.
1969 jumbo. And I still have that watch. That was actually not only my first vintage, but my first two-tone watch that I ever bought.
My first was a two-tone Datejust that I paid $1,400 for.
Yeah. How amazing, right?
Two-tone, like 1601 with a silver dial, or champagne dial, excuse me. And of course, I sadly traded that watch to get something bigger as time went on. I think I got $1,600 for it.
Right, yeah. Well, you made out.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And now you can't get a two-tone Datejust or any Datejust for under $2,000. Please forget it. Yeah. So last but not least, have you ever seen one in person yet?
No, this is the first one I've ever seen.
So this is reference 6239, Paul Newman Daytona. This is not the exact version that Paul himself wore. He wore this reference, but with a white panda dial. This is the black dial version of it, so-called the exotic dial, but obviously now everybody widely recognizes it as a Paul Newman. I'll be honest with you, I wanted to pull out a more standard 4-digit Daytona, but we just sold our last 66.3 and we have a 66.5 on the way, so I didn't have anything else other than a Paul Newman to pull out for you.
This is beautiful. Appreciate you pulling it out.
But I like to show people, regardless of the dial variant, I like for people to experience and handle and try on proper vintage 4-digit Daytonas, because it really is, for me, a sensation like no other. It was, we talked about it on your video for your channel, my first proper vintage purchase, and when I put it on, it was just that like aha moment, you know. It really, really was. That really set me down a tailspin for vintage. They're really special. They really are.
So this is one of the things that I love about vintage Rolex are the proportions. The proportions are proper for the use of the watch.
Yes.
This sits beautifully on the wrist. Is it small? Yeah, it's small for today's standards.
36, right?
Yeah, 36, but I don't know, for me it's not small, you know.
It's not small in my eyes,
right.
But you know, if you were to ask the average collector, they'd be like,
sure.
"Oh my God, that's so small," but it's proportioned beautifully.
Right.
The spacing on the dial is perfect. There's nothing that's overpowering. The bezel's not overpowering like a modern Daytona. It just looks gorgeous and it sits great on the wrist.
Yeah, and you know what? Like, it was a purpose-built watch, you know, modified Valjoux 72 movement. That's still a workhorse to this day. You know, it was a tool watch then, it's a tool watch now. It survived this long, and it's just classic in every sense of the word, you know. Now, whether, you know, it's worth it for somebody to buy it at the current values of these watches, that's a different story.
What's it going for?
That one we have listed for $215 on the website. But again, it's because it's a Paul Newman dial. That with just a regular, more standard production black dial can be had in
$215.
Felix, that's why you're here, man. Come on, dude. It's a tool watch. You're not gonna break it unless you throw it across the hallway. You know, you're not gonna mess it up, dude. Enjoy
That's a fun video.
It would be maybe fun for you, not for me. You know, that watch with the standard dial obviously is a fraction of the price, but for putting the values aside, I just think it's one of those watches, and it reminds me of the first reference Royal Oak, that where they did it best the first time, you know. And that's not to take away from modern Daytonas, because there are some fantastic modern Daytonas. For me, just the feeling that I get when I put on a 4-digit Daytona, not just a Newman, I'm just saying any 4-digit Daytona, is something that I cannot recreate with a more modern watch. I just can't, at least for me, subjectively, you know.
If I were buying today, I think that it would be probably this watch here.
The Rubelite?
You know, it almost looks like a meteorite dial. You know, that's been colored.
Yeah.
That's
actually good. That's a good way to describe it.
And the variation in here is absolutely amazing. And to be honest, I love this color.
Yeah.
You just don't see it.
You couldn't recreate this color any better.
Right.
You know, it's not too purple. It's got a little bit of like pinky red in it. And,
like a magenta, yeah.
Like magenta. And I know that this would go with a lot of different outfits. Yeah. You know, we would not be hard pressed trying to pair it with what you're wearing.
It's, you know what? It's one of those watches you look down and you're like,
it's cool. Look at the heft.
It's cool. It's just cool.
It's just super cool.
We haven't seen the new, the Tiger Stone dial?
Yeah.
Rolex just released, but you probably have.
No, I haven't seen it in person yet. You know,
I feel like all day outshines it.
Yeah.
I'll say this though, of all the new Rolex releases, that's the one I would buy.
Really?
Yeah.
Tiger Stone?
Yeah.
It'd have to be the perfect cut of that stone.
That's the problem, is that
I've seen a couple of photos, and some of them I'm not a big fan of, but if it was the right cut, you know, eye appeal, if it was the right cut, it probably would be really.
Yeah, and it's important, because we have clients all the time who will come look at like a stone dial that we have, and they're like,
what a nature.
Just not, you know, the inclusions I don't like, or the way this color is, you know, and it has to really speak to you. You know, it has to be that perfect cut for what you're looking for, you know?
Yeah, so that's great, man. Thank you for sharing these.
Dude, of course, man.
Yeah, this is awesome. I know that you've got a repeat customer here. 100%.
Even if you're not, you're welcome to come by.
100%.
We can film some videos, hang out anytime you want. Well, I guess that wraps it up. We're not selling Jason a watch. No, but seriously, guys, check out their channel, The Watch Bros. We will link all their information in the description below. They make some fantastic content, and I'm not just saying that because they're sitting next to me. They genuinely are great videos.
We appreciate that.
Give them a follow, give them a watch. Guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Hope to see you guys again in Miami at some point.
You know, absolutely.
Will, thank you so much.
Thanks, bro. Appreciate it.
So is this the time where I tell you I'm working on a video going from a Seiko to AP?